It's great to have back on the program Lee McIntyre, who's a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, also author of the book How to Talk to a Science Denier: Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. It's great to have you back on, Lee.
Thank you for having me back.
So when you started writing this book, it was before COVID, but we ended up with this incredible situation where we are now being held back, in fact, in our battle against this pandemic, in part because of exactly the type of science denial that you write about in the book. And you end up actually including COVID specifically in a chapter.
What happened was I got the contract to write the book just in mid-March 2020, just as COVID was lockdowns were happening. And of course, I'd planned the book, started the research for it even before that. And I told my editor I wanted to save the last chapter for COVID denial. And he said, well, there is no COVID denial. Well, wait. And so I watched COVID denial be born in real time. After having studied science denial all these years and thinking about climate denial and anti-vax, and just watching it fulfill exactly the steps that the other science deniers had laid out, and it was all completely predictable.
So, I mean, where to even start with this? I guess the first thing would be, maybe let's start a little bit with the vaccine issue. Before COVID, you actually had some bipartisanship on vaccine conspiracy theories. You had groups of people on the left who were skeptical of vaccines because of their skepticism of big pharma. And you had people on the right who were skeptical of some vaccines because of their skepticism of anything that is government authorized, of the FDA, et cetera. And there was a little bit of overlap, and you'd have these measles clusters in some places that are left wing and some places that are right wing. When it comes to COVID and the COVID vaccine, it seems to have dramatically shifted to what we would consider the political right. Is that perception true? And why is that?
You got it exactly right. Before COVID, anti-vax was more a bipartisan, or I should say nonpartisan, because you had liberals and conservatives. And yet, in some ways, what happened with COVID is that the anti-vax movement got taken over. Or let me put it this way: this was the kind of thing that the anti-vaxxers were prepared for, and it did get polarized. Of course, Trump and the Republican Party are part of why it got so polarized, and then it has ended up where it is. Some science denial is politically polarized: climate change, COVID. Some of it is not, but that was one thing that we also saw, which was the anti-vax movement morph into the anti-COVID vaccine movement. I'm sure there are still folks who are anti-vaxxers in general who are, on the left.
Sure.
But you're correct that it has been taken over now by the right wing.
What line of argument is most effective, thinking not generally now, just in terms of getting people to re-examine anti-science beliefs, but just to get people vaccinated? What are the lines of argument that you believe would be most effective? Or is it really not about argument and it's just about requirements?
Well, you frame that just right. It's not about argument. But it can't just be about mandates and requirements either.
Okay.
I think there has to be something. I mean, mandates, I think, are part of it, because this kind of denial is killing us. But I think one thing that I recommend in the book is that we make some efforts to actually begin to talk to one another. And it may seem that that's impossible, because facts don't matter in this debate. How much debate does there have to be? The problem is that this, like other forms of science denial, is not just about doubt, it's about distrust. And that wall of distrust has grown when we don't talk to one another. And so I think that the best possible thing we could do to get people to take the COVID vaccine is to reach out to the people who already love and trust us and talk to them. Those are sometimes the hardest conversations, but I think that we have to do it. We have to be respectful. We have to be calm. We have to be empathetic, and actually listen to what people's concerns are. There's a hell of a lot of disinformation out there right now. And if it helps, think of COVID deniers or the vaccine hesitant, however you want to think of them, as victims. They're afraid. and they're all of this disinformation is surrounding them, and they don't know what to do. So just to be somebody who listens, to that family member or friend, ask them why they believe this, why they trust this source, not that. That can actually work wonders.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes perfect sense. And yet I'm imagining even some of the conversations I've had with viewers sometimes who say, well,
Yeah.
listen, the new one is hundreds of thousands of people have died from the vaccine. Okay, so that's one that on August
Right.
24th, a very popular Facebook video started spreading. And you
No.
say to some of these folks, okay, where did you get that idea? Well, I got it from this video. Okay, well, what data is the video citing? And they'll say, just look at the submissions to the VAERS system, the VAERS system. And then you say, well, but listen, have you visited the website? Anybody can submit anything. Nothing on that system is verified. There's a campaign to submit
That's right.
false reports to that. And then they say, no, I believe that it's real. You've not proven that the reports are false. So then where do you go with that?
I think you went a good way down the road of where you go with that. When people insist on proof, I think it's important to point out that that's an unreasonable standard. You don't ask for that standard for, I mean, you could, but it's unreasonable to ask for it for anything else. They haven't proven that aspirin is safe, 100% safe. I mean, that's just not how science works. Science is about building up evidence and warrant for your beliefs, but it's not deductive logic. It's not Euclidean geometry. You can't prove that something is safe. And I think it's also important to point out to folks that just as you did about the VAERS system, that it's being gamed. They're thinking that these are good faith reports, anecdotal reports. Some of those reports are coming in from trolls. They're coming in from folks who are trying to get other people to believe false things. And of course, this isn't going to convince anybody, but it's nonetheless important to know that the other day I read in a PolitiFact that the Poynter Institute, which is a fact-checking organization, had found that zero cases of people dying from the COVID vaccines. So there was not one credible case. Now, that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. It doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. It just means that there is not evidence that it has happened. But, compare that to the ridiculous numbers, sorry, that are being proposed. I've heard people say, that there are 10,000 or more, 100,000 more. Why aren't the media reporting this then? Why are you only finding it in the VAERS system, or you're hearing a rumor from your cousin? These would be reported, but they're not, and it's
Yeah.
because it's fake.
I mean, the problem with that, of course, is, and we've done a bunch of interviews on conspiracism and conspiratorial thinking. If they find evidence for their conspiracy theory, no matter how flaky, it becomes supportive of their
That's
conspiracy
right.
theory. If they find an absence of evidence, like the fact that there is not media reporting, it's part of the cover up and it becomes evidence
Right.
of the conspiracy
That's
theory.
right.
If there is contradictory evidence, then that evidence has been concocted and is not
That's
trustworthy.
right.
And I just don't know how we really deal with that on a wholesale basis. Your ideas make perfect sense. Empathy, listening, one-on-one. It feels very sort of retail. And I don't
Mhm.
know that it deals with the wholesale problem of the millions that fall for this stuff.
Um, you bring up a good point here. Once you're talking to people who have fallen for it, it's in some sense too late.
Oh,
I
it
mean,
is. Okay.
it's already spread, right?
Right.
So, I mean, we should be talking more about who's behind the disinformation campaign and how the disinformation gets amplified.
Mm.
And I can say a little bit more about that if you want to.
Yeah,
But I
please.
mean, but once that's out there in the world, then you do have to talk to the deniers, and let's start with that. Um, it's generally a good idea not to get into a factual debate with them because their position is not really based on facts in the first place. And
Right.
Jonathan Swift said you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. But notice a couple of the things that you've mentioned. They have to do with logic. They have to do with evidence. They have to do with the way that people are reasoning on the basis of evidence. And so to point out, to a conspiracy theorist, Well, what could convince you that this conspiracy theory is wrong then?
Right.
Because if there's evidence for it, you accept it. If there's no evidence, you think that that counts for it too. I mean, how do you know that this is the case? So, talking, and there's in fact good empirical evidence now. There was a study in Nature Human Behavior in 2019 which showed that something called technique rebuttal can work against science deniers. All science deniers engage in the same form of toxic reasoning. They cherry pick facts, they rely on conspiracy theories, they engage in illogical reasoning, they rely on fake experts, and they think science has to be perfect. And once you know that blueprint, you can call them out on it in a respectful way. But you don't have to get into a factual debate, where what often happens with me is somebody will send me an email and say, well, here are 20 things that you need to read immediately. And I'm not going to get into that debate with them because, why are they trying to convince me? If they have the evidence, they should be trying to, convince the CDC or the other scientists. Now they'd say that's part of a conspiracy. What I always do is I punt to the idea of, well, let's talk about your reasoning. Let's talk about how you've come to the conclusions that you've come to. Why do you trust this person? Why do you trust this video that you saw, et cetera, et cetera? And the interesting part here is, to a group of conspiracy theorists, raising the issue of trust, that might work for you.
Right. And the other thing that sometimes, I mean, this is when you get a couple of these conspiracy theorists together, oftentimes their justification, they might end up with the same belief, but with very different justifications. Yes. And getting them to realize that they don't even agree with each other about what even is the proof. Like flat Earth is a classic one, yes, where the explanations for why people come to believe it are often conflict with each other. And it can get pretty interesting when you actually get them saying, well, here's how I came to the conclusion versus how you did. And they conflict very much.
And yet they all ultimately agree with one another on the conclusion, and because of what they have in common, which is distrust. They have distrust of scientists, distrust of the media, distrust of government. And so here's the thing that I found in this research that I've been doing. If it were just about doubt, then evidence would help, because you can overcome doubt with evidence. Scientists do it all the time. But distrust cannot be overcome with evidence alone. Distrust has to be managed by having the person grow to trust you. And how do you do that? You do that through trying to build a personal relationship with them through engagement. Now, that is a very frustrating, uncomfortable, and difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And most people would rather walk away than do that. The reason I wrote the book is to make it clear to people that if you do that, you're being a denier, because there is scientific evidence which shows that everyday ordinary citizens like you and me can go out and talk to science deniers, use technique rebuttal, and maybe change their minds. So why aren't we doing more of that? Now, that's not sufficient. Again, there's the problem of the creation of disinformation and its amplification. We've got to do something about both of those things. But what can we do every day, just right where we sit? We can talk to people who disagree with us. Engage your cousin, engage your uncle at Thanksgiving. Talk to them about why, what are your reasons for not getting the COVID vaccine? We can ask them, we can have a conversation about that.
One of the last things I wanted to talk about, there seems to be this meta problem where, particularly in the Trump era, there is now not even, I don't know if agreement is the right term, but there is a lack of understanding as to what counts as an empirical claim and what is just an opinion. And we are very frequently seeing, for example, when people are presented with just the empirical reality of, for example, whether it was really Trumpists who did the Trump riots. And they come back and say, listen, that's fine. You can believe that. My belief is that it was Antifa. Yeah. And they think that what these issues are issues of opinion when they're really just issues of fact. Is that a broader educational problem, or where does that stem from?
The problem, this is why we need to take science denial seriously, because it's not only about COVID and about climate change, but it has metastasized now to reality denial, what I call post-truth. The Stop the Steal, the idea that the January 6th was Antifa. This is a denialist campaign. It's a classic denialist campaign that follows the same five tropes of reasoning about conspiracy theories, et cetera, that I gave you before. So
Right.
that's why we have to get ahead of this. Now, you ask exactly the right question. Where does this come from? And the answer is it comes from the folks who are creating the disinformation. We've got to stop thinking of science denial as an accident or a mistake. It's a lie. Someone is intentionally creating disinformation, not misinformation, but disinformation. Now, to ask who, quite a bit of it is from foreign intelligence services, for instance, in Russia. People may not believe that, but it is out there. I didn't break into CIA headquarters to get that information. It was out there in major media in about March or April. It was about a 1 or 2 day story. But there was a terrific article in the New York Times about a year and a half ago called Putin's Long War Against American Science. There are Russian troll farms that manufacture disinformation about health issues, about GMOs, about COVID, about anti-vax, because they want to undermine the United States. They want us to be at one another's throats, fighting about what we're fighting about. And they've done a great job of it.
Right.
Here's the interesting next step, though. Though that disinformation is then picked up and amplified on social media, and it doesn't take that many people to do it. There was a story in NPR the other day that the 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people.
Right.
I mean, so this is why we've got to realize we're in an information war, and in an information, as a country, and in an information war, you have to figure out who's spreading the propaganda and how it's being propagated. So I think that in the Wall Street Journal series this week, I think makes a pretty good case that Facebook is not doing a very good job self-regulating. They know how polarizing their platform is. They understand that they're helping the spread of disinformation. They're not doing much about it.
The book is, of course, How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. We've been speaking with the book's author, Lee McIntyre. Lee, always great having you on. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me back.